One thing that struck me when I was reading your story is just the absolute horror of this happening to a child who's abroad, because that feeling of distance from them must be so hard when you're travelling, when you're going out to see what actually happened. How did you cope with that?
Yeah, that was probably you're absolutely right. It was incredibly hard because I think through your child's life, you're there in all their difficult times, when they're born, when they're ill, all of those key moments. And then to be not there when they die is terribly difficult. As, most anybody who's lost a child in a traumatic way, would know. And I think, our immediate urge was we just wanted to be there. Oh, that's a lovely question. So he's a tall, loving boy who gives a good hug, but also loves a bit of banter and teasing and thinks quite deeply about things, understands nature and the outside, and has an absolutely strong conviction that he wants to become a doctor.
So let's hold that in our minds as we talk about him and what happened. He was very young when he went to do basically a bit of work experience, a bit of charity work at a spinal injury unit. What was that part of?
So Horatio knew that he wanted to become a doctor, and as part of that, it's really good to get all sorts of different experiences which might be relevant. And he'd done several different things, but then decided he'd like to do some volunteering, and the Spinal Injury Centre was the place he chose. My husband is a spinal surgeon in Salisbury in the same hospital, but this actually was completely, he didn't want it to be anything to do with David. So he applied himself, he went on the bus. It was totally his world and the thing he wanted to do.
And what did he notice whilst he was there?
So he had lots of, his main role was, a 16-year-old boy, so people taught him to make tea, the patients mainly, I think, and he did a lot of chatting. And the thing that he really noticed was that everybody was stuck inside. There was only a car park to go outside to, and people were completely sort of dislocated from, things that he found helpful in his life. So, trees and the outside and the sounds of nature.
So what did he do with all of that knowledge? Because it is quite remarkable that a 16-year-old boy on work experience comes back and goes, do you know what, I'm just going to change that thing. And I suppose to some people you might think, oh, that's a little bit cocky. But actually it just came from a really beautiful place in his heart, didn't it?
It did. And I think, to start with, David and I were a bit cynical and dismissive, probably, having had careers in the NHS, who know that these things are not straightforward, and that building anything in the NHS is difficult, let alone a garden.
So did you basically do the, yes, well, that's marvellous, darling, yeah, great.
And absolutely. You've got no idea, Horatio, it's far more difficult than you think. So then he decided, and we also said, you can't just have a whim on something like this. You've got to back it up with some evidence. So he said, right, I'm going to do a questionnaire, which he duly did, and he asked patients and staff, and then came back saying, yes, people do want something that's not only a beautiful garden, but somewhere that is subtly accessible, so it doesn't remind them of their disability. And then we started to sort of listen and prick up ears, and he'd also sort of chewed the ear of the chairman of the trust, who happened to come onto the Spinal Injury Centre, and explained to him that he thought this was a good idea. And from there, things started to progress, and they came on board and agreed that the land that had been identified would be fantastic to turn into a garden.
So how far down the line were all of those plans when Horatio went off on the expedition?
Yeah, so we had the land secured, and we were doing a little bit of fundraising. So we had a small amount of money, and we had a sort of modest garden plan, which had been done by one of the members of staff who was interested in gardens. So it was very much back of an envelope staff, but Horatio had all sorts of plans of doing different sponsor this and that, and ways to raise money. So it had been something which we were talking about at home a lot, and within the spinal centre too.
Tell us a bit more about what happened on the expedition. I mean, it is every parent's worst nightmare, isn't it?
It absolutely is. I mean, we all want to support our children, and particularly in that terribly difficult time when you've got to let them start to become really independent and do the things that they want to do. And he really, really wanted to do this. And he went on an expedition with a group from British Exploring, and it was a group of young people. And the idea was a science expedition, and they were going to be, because in long summers they were looking at a diurnal variation and the effect of daylight on things. But at that time, there was unfortunately a lot more sea ice than there would be normally, and there were more polar bears around than they had expected. And because of a number of things which went wrong, a polar bear did get into their camp, and Horatio was attacked. And in that time that he was attacked, he put up a huge sort of defence, and I think he bided time for his friends to escape, but he lost his life.
How many friends were with him, and how many people in charge were there?
So it was a small group. They had 10 young people in the group and 2 sort of leaders who were, young people themselves, really, in their early 20s, but they were trained leaders for the group. And it was a wider group of about 100 of them, I think.
Right. Had anything like that happened before?
No, not to this group or this organisation.
So it wasn't a known danger that you had, in any sense, as parents, had to assess before he embarked on the trip?
Oh no, it was a known danger, but we thought it was a mitigated risk, and as much as any risk can be mitigated, and we had discussed it extensively at home, and we're aware of all the things that have been put in place to make it, safe or safer. And we thought that those were going to work, but they didn't.
But one thing that struck me when I was reading your story is just the absolute horror of this happening to a child who's abroad, because that feeling of distance from them must be so hard when you're travelling, when you're going out to see what actually happened. How did you cope with that?
Yeah, that was probably you're absolutely right. It was incredibly hard, because I think through your child's life, you're there in all their difficult times, when they're born, when they're ill, all of those key moments, and then to be not there when they die is terribly difficult. As most anybody who's lost a child in a traumatic way, would know. And I think our immediate urge was we just wanted to be there.
I know that the inquest revealed quite a lot of incredibly difficult things. I don't know whether you want to talk too much about those now.
No, I mean, I think everything has been kind of said about that, and I'm not sure that there's much more than I can add other than what I've said already.
Yeah.
And that there were failings, and things shouldn't have gone wrong in the way that they did.
But how does a family process that? Does it help at all, or really, really not help?
I think I felt very much that there was no point in having anger, because anger is such a destructive emotion, and I needed to have something that was positive and that celebrated Horatio, because I couldn't change what had happened, and no amount of feeling like that was going to change anything. And so for me, the most important thing to be able to sort of navigate this in order to sort of stay intact for the rest of the family was to find something that brought some purpose and some control and some celebration of Horatio's life.
And so the gardens continued. Yes. How difficult are some days, though, when you find yourself talking about gardens, talking about bringing peace and comfort and help to other people, knowing all the time that it comes really from a place of immense sadness and loss to you and your family as well?
Yeah, of course, there are always difficult times, but, anybody who's experienced a spinal cord injury is facing something very, very akin to bereavement, because it's loss of all of their hopes and dreams, their future plans. There's such an impact on their family, their friends, their community, and they're going through a huge process of adjustment to find something that gives them purpose, something that gives them a sort of little bit of control in their lives, so that they can start to find a future way of being. And so sharing, that sort of emotion of loss that as so many people tragically have to go through is very kind of nourishing and nurturing, really. I suppose in if you look at it from a selfish point of view, but it's doing something with Horatio's ideas, and that has now this huge momentum to it because it makes such a massive difference.
Tell us about the gardens. The first one, where was that completed?
So the first one was in Salisbury, where Horatio was a volunteer, and that's the Regional Spinal Injury Centre for the whole of the South West. And throughout the UK, there's 11 of these big spinal injury centres, fantastic centres of excellence, where people go for rehabilitation when they've had a traumatic event that's meant that they've become paralysed. And so now as a charity, Horatia's Garden, we are endeavouring to bring gardens to all those spinal injury centres, and then we run them as really thriving, vibrant spaces to hopefully support patients to find that purpose, find the future, to adjust with their families. Because, as humans, we're all biophilic beings. We need nature around us.
Well, you've used a word I don't understand there, Olivia. Biophilic.
Biophilic. So we're hardwired, really, to be comforted by nature, whether that's trees, whether it's being under the sky, whether it's feeling sunlight on our faces. All of these things have a huge physiological effect on us. And in our society now, at times the people are most stressed. So whether they're severely ill, perhaps they're in an elderly care home, in prison, we're removing people from all of that naturally comforts us. And as a result, what happens is your cortisol levels go up, your blood pressure goes up, you're generally feeling much more stress, your sleep patterns are all over the place. And none of these things help people who need to recover. So it's about trying to get this to be seen in the evidence is there, without a doubt. The science is there to back up that we shouldn't be removing people who are in chronic ill health or facing acutely unwell situations from nature.
And it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that there isn't enough room really in the NHS at the moment in terms of budget or, possibly energy. I'm sure there is goodwill for it, but to be able to do this kind of thing within a normal hospital budget and setting.
Yeah, I mean, those are challenges, particularly when hospitals are often built piecemeal. And so we've been fortunate in that all the spinal injury centres in the UK have some space, so it's adjacent to the garden, to the spinal centre, which is absolutely crucial, obviously. But you're right that even if the garden was put in, it tends to be put in as a low-maintenance garden. And maintenance is often the big issue. And so for us, these gardens are high maintenance on purpose. So we sort of flip the whole thing on its head, because then we know that a high maintenance garden means there's all year round seasonality and interest. So whatever time of year you come in there, even if it's on a grim old November day, you're going to find something that's growing.
That's a very good point, yeah, because you wouldn't really want to look at just spindly tree branches in that kind of harshness of a wintry setting, would you?
Absolutely. And they also need to be maintained, and so you need people in them, and then that becomes the social part of the project, which having people around you when you're going through a trauma is absolutely crucial, and whether those are your relatives and friends who can then come be in the garden with you and alongside you, or whether it's our volunteer gardeners chat about anything other than what's going on in your medical situation. It all helps.
You mentioned relatives and friends there. I did listen, and everybody can do this too, to some of the tributes that were paid to Horatio. at a service in Salisbury Cathedral by some of his friends. Excuse me, I'm tearing up just thinking about it, because the young people just spoke so amazingly about losing this friend. Do you keep in touch with them? Do they keep in touch with you?
Absolutely. And they've been such a joy, such a support. I think, particularly for his friends who he was at school with, they were very, very close. They'd been together for 4 years. And they were 17-year-old boys too, who don't on the whole have a language for bereavement. And they needed to find a way to be able to sort of express it.
Yeah, I mean, they did it beautifully. They said such moving things. I think it must be so hard as a parent, though, Olivia, to watch the contemporaries of your child go on to do all of the things that your child can't. But does it also bring some kind of comfort to you as well?
Well, it does. I mean, to start with, it was really hard. But we knew that they were all grieving so much as well. We needed to do it all together. And they've been such wonderful friends to Horatio's brothers, and to us. And, they're now 2-1 involved with the charity, the sort of succession of the charity, and the vibrancy and energy that comes from them. And then the many other young people who've sort of joined them because they've been touched by perhaps friends who've had spinal cord injuries, or the charity in some other way. So there is a big cohort of, I call them young people, but they're now getting on. They're in their late 20s now. And a growing cohort of those people who want this. They understand that, nobody should have to be in the situation of having a devastating, life-changing injury without having somewhere that's not Formica to recover in.
I did love some of the little details as well that were mentioned. Were you aware that his early teenage parties were based around his desire to have a lot of low-alcohol beer and pavlova?
Probably not.
I just love the addition of low alcohol, because I can imagine someone writing that thinking, yeah, his parents will be there, so we'll say it was low alcohol. Probably wasn't. You're obviously incredibly proud of Horatio and what he achieved in his life and the impetus that he has given to something that lives long after him. Do you ever stop to think that actually he's probably immensely proud of you?
I hope so. I really do. I think he'd be amazed. I think he'd be absolutely kind of thrilled and proud that there is change, and that, it's not only changed within our charity work and what we're doing, but, over the 10 years we've been doing it, the importance of gardens and health has been more recognised. And so if we can be starting that bigger dialogue, and that there's going to be many more people who are impacted for the better by this, then I think he'd think, yeah, this is, he'd be pleased it's based on science, he'd be pleased it's based on evidence, and he'd be really happy that change is afoot.